We absolutely cannot hear you, and I'm sure what you're saying is brilliant, but we just can't hear a thing.
And you cannot hear us. Can you hear us? But yeah, let's give it at least one more minute to the five and then we can start. So still people are coming in. But welcome everybody, everyone that's coming in, and we're just waiting to see also if Shellen can have a better audio because we really like her to be the host. She's very good at this. And welcome Ale also here today.
Please, Tim and I don't underestimate yourself. You are also very good as a host. So,
You
Sorry,
know,
Shailen, can you try unmuting again?
I think she figured out something. She made a face like
you
realization
did.
thing.
There's like this finger. Hold on. Wait. As we're waiting, just welcome to everyone. It's always wonderful to see all the locations where you're coming from and how everyone is. So lovely to see you all. Um, Hopefully we'll have the technical difficulties sort of with Shellen and we'll get to hear her.
What is happening today?
Yes, there you are. We have her.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good middle of the night, as per I say the third time. Um, we are now recording. Remember, keep your video off if you don't want to be recorded or anonymous. And I will let Dr. Harrington or Alex take it from here.
Dr. Harrington, dear God, really? Are we at that point? We're 3 weeks in. I think Alex is perfectly acceptable. Thank you, Shellen. It was lovely to be able to hear Shellen and to see so many friends at this point. We were just having a conversation, Shellen and I, last night, and lamenting the fact that this is week 3, which is wonderful, but it also means that it's week 3 and it's getting close to the end. So we have to continue, collaborating with many of you and find ways to continue this because we'll miss you all. Anyway, but before we get sentimental, that will happen next week. We have other things we have to talk about, and I would like to open with the apology of having been in a very delayed train on the weekend. So I missed the session with questions, but we will continue doing that. And if you have specific questions that weren't addressed, feel free, send them in. And either I can respond directly to you or we can address them throughout the week and then on the weekend. So please, if you had lingering questions, don't feel like that opportunity is gone. We are happy to address them. And I also wanted to point out, because I promised I would do it last week, that we have moved on to Korea. So the mugs that we are featuring each week have now moved on to Korea. So there we go. Anyway, and we will now turn to the very serious business of me trying to figure out how to share my screen, which likely will happen, but sometimes it's better than not. And then let's see if that works. There we go. Someone telling me if it's not working. And then we will put it in presenter mode because I figured out finally how to do that. And there we go. Excellent. And Jimena is telling me yes, and Jimena always tells me when there's a problem, so I thank her very much for that. Um, so today we move on from our previous discussions of what international law is and who makes it and who it applies to, etc. And the concept of the multilateral environmental agreements, the MEAs that we talked about last week. And we talk now this week about treaty negotiations. Now, this will be a very kind of broad discussion in the sense that we'll talk about things that are important phases and different steps of treaty negotiations. And then we will get to the specifics of a case study next week. So next week, we will use the plastic treaty, the negotiations for the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including the marine environment, which is mandated by UNEP, but which we all lovingly or not, depending on the day, referred to as the Global Plastics Treaty, as the case study. And that is certainly something that is a useful case study in the sense that it is currently ongoing. It is also what brought many of us together, including Shellen and myself, and then CYMG and myself. So it's a dear thing to my heart for those reasons. But first, we need to understand kind of what the system is, what the structure is, and then we'll understand more of what goes on an actual case study of a negotiation. Um, Again, please post questions in the chat. We will get to as many of them as possible today, and if not, we'll either roll them into Thursday and or into the weekend. But I know that at this point things start to get really technical. And they can be a bit confusing, and they're confusing for many people who've been in the space for a very long period of time. So don't feel like you can't ask any questions. I really encourage you to. But in particular, by the end of this week, we will learn about some really critical things like what are the essential elements of a treaty negotiation? What are the important things that often sound very dull or very kind of um, pro forma standard, but can actually be very important and either make or derail treaty negotiations. And here we're particularly talking about things like the rules of procedure. And when we get into next week for the discussion of the Global Plastics Treaty, we certainly will see the role of rules of procedure there as a very interesting method of influencing the negotiations. You'll also get a sense about the logistical details. So, believe it or not, I think the best analogy is negotiations are kind of like going to the cinema or going to the theater. Your experience tends to have many different components, but one component is where your seat is. And you can't just walk in and take any seat. Like you have to have a ticket if you're going to the cinema or if you're going to the theater. And similarly, you have to have a valid credential and sit behind your appointed place, your appointed seat area in the negotiations. So we'll talk about that. Um, some most fun analogy I can possibly find for talking about where you sit as an important point. Well, also, by the end of this module, you'll know about the phases of negotiations, also really critical terminology, and what the negotiation practice is like, and also how various actors can be directly involved. So for today, we'll go through until we get to the discussion of terminology, etc., and then we'll continue that on Thursday because that's a very different thing and really deserves a lot of time and attention. Now, as a reminder to set the stage, how do we start treaty negotiations? How are they structured? And then also this question of why are there multiple rounds of negotiation in a standard treaty negotiation? And the photo that I found here is the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly Hall in New York, to make a contract. So when we think about the General Assembly meeting, we think about it meeting on a regular schedule. It talks about typically a set agenda of things, and then things are added as necessary. But it is planned, it is scheduled, it always happens in New York, et cetera, et cetera. Treaty negotiations are very much not like that. And they are instead far less frequent. They are created for a shorter period of time, typically. And most often they will rotate. And we'll get to rotation momentarily. But to remind you from last week, the idea of treaty law is that treaty law is developed by states, by the international community of states, on the idea of sovereignty and on the idea that all states come together or those that are interested come together and they negotiate with each other to create a new instrument, a new, whether it's hard law, soft law, but if we're talking about treaties, typically hard law instrument for a particular topic and a particular purpose. And sometimes this is done because an entity like the UN Environment Assembly and then UNEP convenes this type of negotiation. Sometimes it's also done because a group of states decide they want to do it. And it is indeed possible for states to decide they want to create their own treaty system outside of the UN system, outside of the UN General Assembly, suggesting it and authorizing it outside of UNEA and UNEP, or outside of what we think about with, for example, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, which came out of BB&J, which came out of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea system. So typically, the international treaties negotiation process will take place under the auspices of a UN entity, or if we're looking at regional treaties, under the regional agreements that is applicable. That is not always the case. However, it doesn't have to be the case. And so it is possible for states to say, well, you know what, we all want to come together just on our own and negotiate something. And there could be a number of reasons for that. It could be that there is a sense that perhaps it would take too long to get an official UN entity to adopt a resolution to create those negotiations. It could be a feeling that we need a very specific type of structure that for the negotiations that might not necessarily fall under the UN aegis. There are a number of reasons. But at the beginning, we have to have the agreement of states to be part of the negotiations. And if not, then it's really kind of useless. You sit in a lovely room and look around, no one's there. So there's that. Um, Whatever instrument is the instrument that authorizes the negotiations, whether it is a resolution of the UN Environment Assembly or the UN General Assembly, whether it is a resolution from the Organization of American States or the African Union, or whether it is an agreement, a written agreement by parties and states coming together to say we want to have a negotiation, it is important to remember that whatever is in that agreement sets the boundaries, sets the structure of what the treaty negotiations will look like. So, how often will they meet? Is there a timeline? All of these things will typically be set out in that document, and that gives us the structure. But within that structure, there are many common elements. And so we'll talk about the common elements throughout the rest of today. Um, which gets us to this question of why are there multiple rounds of negotiation? Why don't we, as many people have said to me, I think in frustration after the multiple rounds of the plastics treaty negotiations, why don't we just lock everyone in a room and that's it? Why do we keep rotating? Um, it's really just a standard practice at this point. And then B, typically international treaties are very complex. They are very difficult to negotiate, and they require multiple rounds because negotiating an entire treaty, the entire treaty text of, say, 20, 30 articles or more, as well as the preamble, takes a great deal of time. It takes a great deal of consultation going back and forth between the country representatives who are the negotiators and then their home countries, their home governments, what we call making calls to capital and getting advice from various countries. And it takes a lot of understanding of what each element of a treaty will look like and then how it will interplay with the other. So typically, we don't see just one massive negotiation that might go on for months, where we're all locked together. As much as I would love the excuse to spend months in Geneva, um, surrounded by Swiss chocolate, Shellen would too. We don't do that typically. We see that there are rounds. The rounds are scheduled. They're predictable. This allows us to say, all right, in the beginning we'll address this, then we'll move on to this, then we'll move on to this. It also allows countries and their negotiators the ability to go see what happens, participate, come back home, take stock, perhaps see what else is happening in other treaty negotiations or in other conferences of the parties and international law aspects that are relevant to the development of policies moving forward, and then go on to the next phase, etc. So it sets a certain amount of predictability and also fairness. And as we talked about last time, in response to the question of why we don't just have one massive conference of the parties for all the treaties coming together. As fun as that sounds in many ways, there are also a number of countries, the vast majority of countries in the international system who do not have a great number of people present at any negotiation. Indeed, many countries have one, sometimes two, if, for example, the UN Environment Program is able to pay to provide a second seat and cover their cost of travel and accommodation. But otherwise, they'll only have one person. And so having them be there for the entirety of a treaty negotiation process, if we just locked everyone in a room and said you're stuck till we have a treaty, would be very difficult. And it also does get to the personal element we talked about last week of negotiators also having lives, believe it or not. We do, shockingly. Anyway, so that's why we have multiple rounds. Now, why do we rotate, or what are options for rotation? There are many different aspects to this. And so what I wanted you to do is take a lovely walk down memory lane with me. And Shellen, part of memory lane will also involve you because you were in some of these places. But these photos are photos of the first four venues that we had for the INT process for plastics. Let's see, if we start to the furthest top and furthest to the right, we have Punta del Este in Uruguay. Then if we actually go down, for some reason my slide didn't really put this in proper order. To the bottom left, we have the UNESCO offices in Paris, which is number two. Then next to it, we have Nairobi and the UNEP offices there for number three. And finally, we have the lovely Shaw Center in Ottawa. That's right, possibly the most action I saw. Anyway, but for INC4. So this is to give you the sense that in the plastics treaty negotiations and in many other negotiations, we rotate. So the decision was made that there would not be a fixed location. The locations of each session, and there were five, conveniently corresponding, five authorized, conveniently corresponding to the five geographic regions of the UN. So there was a sense that it was important to get input of each of these regions in the negotiations. And as a result, the negotiations would rotate. So the first one was held in Uruguay. Second one was held in Paris. The third was held in Nairobi in Kenya. The fourth was held in Ottawa in Canada. And then the fifth was held in Busan in the Republic of Korea. This allowed for a great deal of presence of groups that might not be able to travel, especially outside, so stakeholders, observers who might not be able to travel to, say, New York consistently for all of these meetings, but they would be able to travel to Nairobi if there was one that was in the African region. And so this was the idea, was to try to get as much participation and buy-in as possible that way. There are treaties that have been negotiated all out of one base. So, for example, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement was negotiated out of the New York UN headquarters office because that's where the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and its associated bodies are based. So every session of the negotiation was held in New York. And that provided predictability, right? It provided predictability. Everyone knew whenever the negotiations were, they had to go to New York City. Of course, New York City is very expensive. It's very difficult to get to. And that also meant that a lot of voices couldn't be brought in because it was difficult for them to physically get there. And also visa issues, et cetera. So those are some of the things that we think about when these decisions are made. And ultimately, we have different systems. they tend to have the same type of result, hopefully, at least in the plastics context as well. But it is a very important aspect of understanding the goals and the involvement, for example, of observers and stakeholders in the process, as well as the desire to see, for example, what the nature of the problem is in multiple places and get those perspectives. And you're able to do that very well when you move around and when you have a rotating venue system for each stage. So there is that. And it gives us all the ability to say we've traveled to lovely places like Korea. See, there we go. Indeed, this mug came from the INC process. So there we are. Now, the other option to point out is that we have a set schedule typically of negotiations, again, for predictability, for planning, for the secretariats that are created to facilitate the negotiations, to do their work, and to get documents and to book rooms, etc. But we also have the option, and depending on the negotiation parameters, this is there or not, or needs to be authorized separately, of using intersessional work and also information gathering. As the name suggests, intersessional work happens between the formal negotiation sessions. And because intersessional work is not typically intended as a negotiation, the outcomes will be things like reports. The hope is that there will be kind of areas of convergence or findings, that there could be areas of convergence on really critical areas and topics for the negotiations that might be difficult to get to some type of agreement on during the negotiations, or that we think might need more background. So something that's very scientific or something that's very technical, technical in the scientific sense, technical also in the legal sense, might be sent for intercessional work so that experts and people who have a lot of background in it can really spend more time working together, talking through the problems, getting different perspectives, and coming up with options and coming up with information that can then be taken back to the negotiators and used as part of the negotiation process rather than developed within the negotiation process. This allows obviously for a lot more kind of digging into the topic and digging into information. And it also allows for information to be readily available during the negotiation processes, which are typically very short. So typically we don't have a long time. And indeed, many of the conferences of the parties themselves, once the treaty is adopted, are far longer than each of the negotiation sessions. So often it's 5 days to 7 days at a clip, which is not a long time when you think that you have to have a lot of the formalities we'll get to momentarily also taking place. It really isn't a long time. And if you're able to go in with intercessional work, outcomes that have given reports on, say, what type of definitions we might want to use for a treaty or for core terms, that gives a really strong background to negotiators to start talking about those without having to come up with them themselves and then talk about them in the process. And you see a photo here of Busan. I'm sorry, Shellen, if it brings back some, very late night memory. But again, I wanted you to see the various venues. And after this, I think we start getting into my own photos. So if they're truly terrible, it's my fault. Anyway, um, the rules of procedure for negotiations are actually very important. And they tend to be things that most people, even many lawyers, kind of look at as formalities, they look at as pro forma, but they can indeed be very important. And we'll talk about this in the plastics treaty context next week to give you a sense of why and how they can be so important. But the rules of procedure are, as the name suggests, the rules that structure, that govern the way that the negotiations happen. They explain how the negotiation is convened, who has what power in terms of the election of a chair and typically vice chairs, or something called a bureau, which will be comprised of representatives from the various regions who will be nominated. They will be state representatives, but they'll be nominated by the region and are supposed to serve the region and advise the chair. Also, things like the secretariat will have inputs, and so that input will be governed by the rules of procedure and the actual conduct of the meetings. So, how do you call a meeting to order? Um, what are the sessions that have to happen? And critically, uh, who can be accredited? Who is able to be in the room, who can speak, who can sit there and not participate, um, how orders are determined, et cetera, for speaking. So will states have priority? And then if there's the opportunity and the time for observers and stakeholders to speak, will they then have the opportunity? Will everyone have an equal opportunity? And that's very rare, but we saw it in the negotiations for the Global Framework on Chemicals um, as a kind of an outlier, but still it's there as an option. And also, many of us who are involved in the Plastics Treaty will now shudder in terms of voting and in terms of what the procedure is, or if there is a procedure, how it works for voting. So as a foreshadowing of next week, um, various systems have treaty systems have various types of rules of procedure relating to voting. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, also extending to the Paris Agreement and the entire Conference of the Parties system related to the UNFCCC, uses rules of procedure that require all decision making to be by consensus, which means if one country disagrees, that's it. Everyone has to agree to whatever the measure is. And the idea behind this is really to, at the most high level, recognize that every state is a sovereign, and so it shouldn't be required to act according to a COP decision, for example, that is made over its objections. That is one system. The standard UN Environment Assembly and UNEP rules, which have become also the rules for the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, the Minamata Convention, and a number of other related conventions, have a voting option. So where there is an issue on the table where there is largely agreement between countries, but either a country or a small group of countries continues to say no and hold it out. It is possible under these rules to, at least in theory, it's really not been done much in practice, but at least in theory, to have a state request a vote on that measure. It actually requires a vote to then take the vote under the rules of procedure, so you have to have two votes. It's very confusing. I have seen this done, and it is a very solemn experience, right? Like the room goes quiet, and uh, they actually do lock the doors. So they lock the doors. You can't go in or out. There are security people at the doors. You can't go in or out. And once you're in the room, you're in the room. So get your coffee beforehand, and make sure you're all settled. And then one at a time, each country comes up and places its ballot, and ballots are distributed beforehand. Again, very formal process. Um, each country has a representative that goes up to the box, places their ballot in the box, and then returns to its seat. There are UN security members guarding the box at all times. Then that box goes away. The votes are counted. We all wait, and then the results come back in. Um, it is a very solemn process. It requires either a two-thirds or three-quarters majority, depending of states, depending on whether the issue is deemed to be substantive or procedural, in order for the matter to pass. And that is a decision that typically under the UN Environment Program and UNEA rules is allocated to the chair. of the process. So the chair will have the ultimate say as to whether or not something is considered substantive or procedural. This can really be a make or break moment for a negotiation. It can also be a make or break moment in a conference of the parties. So I highlight this here because the rules of procedure are typically things that we all just assume are there. They're guidelines, and we don't have to worry about them because the Secretariat knows them really well, and they structure all of the negotiation sessions accordingly, and they write the agenda accordingly. But they do have a very important point, and they do have a very important role when things get to be very contentious. And so it is important to know that they are there, which is why I spend so much time on them. They've also become so much a part of my life. Anyway, in addition to that, we have just some really important logistical details. So when we're thinking about setting the stage for a negotiation, we think about the very high level. What will the venue be? Now, this venue in the photo here is from the CICG, which is located in Geneva. It is not where we will be for INC 5.2 because it is too small, but it is where we do a number of different negotiations, including this will be my future home for 2 weeks for the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, Conference of the Parties, and associated topic negotiations there. But we think about this, it's very high level. Okay, we're going to whatever country for the negotiations. But we also have to remember that there are a number of different, very mundane, but very important things that go into a negotiation. So the first thing is the idea of registration. So whether you're representing a country or an intergovernmental organization, an international organization, or a civil society member that is accredited, you can't just go walk through, say, the CICG doors and say, "Hi, I'm here. I want to attend." You have to register first. And you have to register typically in the UN system. You have to register through a dedicated website and dedicated system. The registration will require you to say who you are, provide background information, provide a photo, which is typically terrible. And then will require you to provide information on the organization or the state that you're part of, and typically a letter from the head of your delegation saying that you are going to be there representing your either organization or country, and that you have permission to be registered. Without this, you will not go into the UN system. And then without being in the UN system and without being cleared, you will not be able to attend the negotiations. So the registration is a really critical element. It's also an element that often has issues. Sometimes things are not processed properly. Sometimes there are questions about the organization and its accreditation. Sometimes the systems go down. And they just go down, and it's always an issue of kind of how the system will respond. And so you're always encouraged to have things like a very robust file of saved emails as to what type of information is available from or was sent to you from the registration site. The other question is your classification and whether you will be attending as a member of a state party delegation or whether you will be attending as a member of the observers and civil society or stakeholder classification. Most UN negotiations, at least now, and especially those associated with UNEP, are focused on the idea of really keeping a presence for observers, for stakeholders. And certainly when we get to our discussions next week, we'll talk about that a great deal more in the plastics context, where this was mandated as part of the resolution. But there are different powers. So you have different roles. You have different roles as a country representative. You get to speak essentially first, and in some instances more often. If you are a member or observer, a member of civil society and stakeholders, you have to wait until a certain designated time and then you're able to speak. You also sit in different places that we'll get to momentarily. So your classification is very important, and it's important to know what that classification is before you go. The other thing that is important is the idea of getting visas. And I say this, it seems again pro forma, but I say this because a number of you may be interested at some point in attending a negotiation, or in talking to those who might be attending. And so I just wanted to point out that simply registering for the particular treaty negotiation is not enough. It is not enough to say that you can then enter any particular country for a negotiation. You do have to go through a visa process. Typically, at least basic background information is provided on the websites for the various negotiations themselves. But it is a very clear thing that although letters will be issued for you, the UN agencies themselves are not able to get clearance for anyone to go through the visa process and be cleared without the country itself. And so it is a process. And it's often one that becomes actually a bar or a barrier, because visas take time. We know this. Visas take time, especially visas from a lot of countries that are considered to be developing countries, um, or countries that don't have as robust visa reciprocity with others countries and other states. Which means that if you have someone coming from a country and they find out at the very last minute that they're able to attend a negotiation and they're not part of a government delegation, they're part of an observer, a stakeholder delegation, often there are issues in actually getting visa clearance or being able to attend for the whole time, because the visa process may take several weeks and they may have only found out the week before the negotiation. So it can be a hindrance. And I raise this because it is something that certainly a number of civil society organizations have brought up and brought to the attention of various negotiation facilitators and organizations as a constant theme and a constant bar and concern. So I have no good suggestions other than do it early when you can, but I just wanted to make sure that you are aware that that can be one of the background bits that can often cause a problem or hinder some participation. Um, when you register, this is the lovely room in Bangkok in Thailand, by the way. If you're wondering where this is, when you register, you also have to go and get credentials. Many of us collect our credentials. I have a whole bunch of them hanging off my desk. My partner's using the office, otherwise I would go and show you. They do a video tour to show you. We collect them as badges of honor. But you do have to actually go again on site and register and collect credentials, etc. And this could take a very long time, especially on the opening days, because everyone comes. So if you're talking about maximizing participation, um, for anyone who goes to a negotiation, I would recommend looking to see the schedule, seeing when the registration opens. Typically, it opens a day or two before the actual sessions start, and going early to get your credentials. Otherwise, you might miss important details because you're still in the line. It also means that if there are any issues, and frequently there are, just because computers are, you know, fallible as well as people, they can be sorted out before the negotiations start. Which then gets us to, okay, you have the credential, you have the visa, you've registered, you've gotten in, you've gotten over your jet lag, you are at the negotiation. Excellent. You walk into the room and you want to go sit up front and take in everything. He's chilling laughing. And you can sit up front if you are part of a national delegation that perhaps represents a country that begins with A or B or maybe C. Then you get to sit up front. Congratulations, Armenia, Albania. Wonderful, you're there. Excellent. You get to sit right up in the front like all the eager students I have in my class. I don't have that many. They like to sit in the back. Anyway, um, but everyone else, however, is subject to the rules of both states having priority over observers and stakeholders, and also the alphabetical system, the English alphabetical system, having pride of place in terms of where you get to sit. So if you are a country, you'll be seated in the front rows, or at least up front, but you will be seated in alphabetical order in English, typically in English. So you will have to sit behind your designated plaque. If you look closely in this photo, you will see that there are plaques for each country. Depending on the venue size, each country will get a plaque with a microphone, and then either one or two seats allocated to it up front, which means typically heads of delegation or those who are authorized to speak for the countries will sit there behind the microphone. And if they want to speak, you press a button or a series of buttons or muck it up, as I always do, but you try to get on the indication list for wanting to speak, and then you're able to speak from that seat. There are also typically 2 to 3 seats behind those main seats at the table. And those seats are for extra members of delegations, they're for advisors, they're for people who go in and out. But they are held for the members of that particular delegation. So you get, say, 2 seats up front and then 2 seats in the back. Um, I will not comment on the comfort of some of these seats. I'll just say that some are more comfortable than others, but the countries do get that number of seats. Now, next after the countries come the observers, and even in the observer section, there is a sense of hierarchy and priority. So the next seating with allocated plaques goes to intergovernmental organizations, so UN agencies, international organizations. I will admit the IUCN that I typically represent when I'm in negotiations. Um, we all get a nice plaque with our name. Often we get a designated seat. So we're told to sit here. Depending on the venue, we may just get 1 seat by a microphone and then 1 seat behind, or sometimes we get two. Um, and then we go to the other open classification of observers and stakeholders. And that is where things tend to be more open in the sense of not having name cards given to you, or not having seats assigned to you, but instead having open seating. So you sit anywhere you can, preferably by a microphone, or you try to find somebody who's a friend by a microphone, and then they will help you to speak if you want. But there is no assigned seating, and there is no assigned plaque, etc. at that point. If you cannot fit into the room, there are often overflow rooms, especially for the opening and closing sessions. Obviously, in those rooms, you can't speak. There are no microphones, but you can certainly attend. And once you are in these rooms, and once you are at the venue, properly seated, the speaking abilities will always go to countries first and then to observers. So if it's an opening plenary, all the countries will indicate that they want to speak. So they'll hit their particular microphone, the button on the microphone, and it will turn to a lovely color, and then that will indicate to you that you are on hold. Essentially, typically it will turn green in the UN system, and you're on hold, you're in the queue. And when it turns red, it means that you are able to speak. Once the countries have finished speaking, then if there is time, the observers will have the ability to speak. And most often in the opening and closing formal plenaries, we see preference given first to the intergovernmental organizations and UN bodies, and then others throughout the other aspects of the negotiations. This tends to be a bit more open to the extent that there is time for the inclusion of open microphones for stakeholder and observer participation, which gets us to the stages of the negotiation itself. So we don't just like go down to our seats, sit there, and just jump in. We want to. We desperately want to, because by the time you get to a treaty negotiation, you've read all the documents, you have your arguments ready, you have your points ready, you know what you want, you know the compromise areas, everything else. But you have to go through the formalities. And again, the rules of procedure tell you you have to go through the formalities. So the first formality, and this is from, I made the slides, but I made the slides, I can't remember which one this is from. This is from Ottawa. So if you see the slide and you see the photo here, this is from Ottawa, Shellen. I'm sorry, it's going to bring back memories. But this is from the opening and closing plenary hall in Ottawa. So it will typically always look like this, right? There are big screens and reminding you, in case you forgot, where you are and why you're there. And then everybody takes photos and the selfies and everything else. But the first thing that we do is we open with the opening plenary. And the plenary is a very fancy way of saying everyone, all countries, all observers, all stakeholders, everyone comes together. They come together in the same room, they sit together, and they debate, discuss, go through formalities together. So the opening plenary comes, the chair opens the meeting. Typically, the uh, president or prime minister or someone from a high ministerial level of the country that is hosting will come, will make opening remarks, welcoming everyone. Sometimes there's a cultural performance or something like that to remind you where you are and allow you to enjoy some bit of culture before you get into the craziness of the negotiations. Um, and things like the agenda will be adopted at the opening plenary. Things like elections of officers. So there are sometimes open seats for, as I mentioned, the Bureau or for various other types of representation in the negotiation process. And those seats will need to be filled. So we need to have a slot there for appointment of people to those seats. Um, any issues, any other issues that are lingering, residual issues, things like rules of procedure or other types of issues will come up typically in the opening plenary. Lots more. Assuming that all is settled, the chair will then typically ask for agreement on his or her version of what the contact groups will look like. And then, assuming everyone agrees and there is no objection, authorize the contact groups to go and meet. And then tell them when they're supposed to report back. And then we have a midpoint plenary to address this. Now, for those of you who are sitting there going, what on earth is a contact group? A contact group, and please remember that everybody has this feeling at some point in their life where they just don't know what it is, and it sounds like, I don't know. We're all making contact all the time. Why do we need groups for it? But a contact group is a smaller negotiation group, and this is really where you see the negotiation happen. There can be two, there can be more, but for equity's sake, the push recently has been to have two at the most, because we typically have very small delegations, as I mentioned, as well as very large delegations. And so for equity, two is typically the number. And the contact groups get specific mandates from the chair and from the larger plenary to address certain issues. So they are supposed to address, say, financing mechanisms or capacity building or what the core elements of a treaty should be or what the preamble should be, etc. And they have to actually conduct the negotiations in those small groups. So those small groups, the contact groups, will break out, they'll meet in separate rooms. They have typically co-chairs, so often two, sometimes three co-chairs who are designated, who are nominated by the plenary and agreed to by the plenary. And then those are country delegates, country negotiators, who then, when they're in that role, are serving as basically neutrals, trying to facilitate the work of the contact group, the negotiation, rather than acting in a nationally partisan way. Um, they conduct the meetings of the contact groups, and they conduct the way that the contact groups operate, typically using the rules of procedure, obviously. They control the ability of, based on time, civil societies or stakeholders and observers, et cetera, to participate in the contact groups and speak or not. And often, especially as we start to get into the really difficult discussions, there becomes more of a limited place for, unfortunately, observers and stakeholders because of the nature of the time pressure and the issues involved, and the fact that the states are ultimately the ones that will be adopting this, hopefully adopting the treaty itself. So the contact groups will have their meetings. They can meet frequently. They can also split into subgroups that look at specific issues and really try to negotiate specific issues. Typically, what we see is an effort to keep these at like 3 hour blocks at a time. Now, that is never honored in the practice, and they usually go way over, but there is an attempt. There is more of an attempt to make sure that we don't go past 10 p.m. Negotiating each night. And some people have been quite impassioned about that in the treaty process for the plastics treaty. Um, Especially when we have things like jet lag, et cetera. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it isn't. But the contract groups meet basically throughout the day on most of the negotiating days. And then when they are asked to, they report back to the full plenary on the types of progress that they've made. If they have a problem, if they have a question, or if there's an issue that comes up that needs to be resolved, they can also ask for the plenary to meet and address that specific issue. We also have the potential to use informal groups and also things called friends of the chair or friends of the co-chair. And these are, as the name suggests, much smaller groups. They can meet to try to really break down an issue if there are only a few states that have a particular issue they cannot agree on. They just cannot agree on an aspect of, say, a definition, rather than making everyone sit through a protracted debate on this. It is possible for the chair of the contact group or the chair overall of the negotiating process to say we're going to create an informal group. So it's not going to have the same powers as a contact group or the plenary, but it's going to be really geared towards the countries that are having this particular problem, so they can try to talk it out and figure it out while the rest of us move on to other things. So that can happen. We also have things called Friends of the Chair or the Co-Chair, and these are again informal groups that are there to help, hence the friends designation, help the chair or the co-chairs by often acting as potentially intermediaries or informal arbitrators, informal mediators of particular questions that come up that are very difficult to settle, but really only exist between a few countries. So the idea, again, is to try to take um, the ability of smaller arguments between a smaller number of states out of the ability to then kind of slow the whole process and settle it through these informal mechanisms. Now, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. This obviously has a sense of criticism from many people in the sense that they are often not as transparent, and that is very true, but sometimes they can help to facilitate an agreement. I should mention, we'll probably run a few minutes over. I should mention, though, when we're talking about contact groups, the rules are slightly different for contract groups. So typically in the open plenary, people take photos, they take selfies, um, they share with their friends, they share it on social media. We all do it. Fine. I have some lovely photos of Shellen speaking, for example, during INC5, but there's that. But that was during a plenary. During the contact groups, you don't take photos. Photos are not allowed. Videos are not allowed. You cannot tweet or dates me. You cannot post on any social media. You cannot have any live reporting, etc., about what goes on in the contact groups whilst they are open for people to attend. Their work is considered to be subject to a bit of a privilege, and that idea comes from the sense of allowing countries to fully air their views and comfortably air their views without them being recorded, without them being put out to the broader world that isn't in the INC or other negotiation process. So it is important to note that, and I do mention that also because if any of you are going to a negotiation now or in the future, it's important to know not to do things like film or take photos during the contact groups because that can get you in a great deal of trouble with security, etc. And finally, we get to this lovely photo of the outside of the UN compound in Bangkok, in Thailand. That was like the closest I got to the outside for several days, but it was lovely, beautiful. And as we look at the stages of negotiation, as I mentioned, there typically is like halfway through what we call a stock taking plenary. So that's typically scheduled, although it also often moves depending on the rhythm of the contact groups. But the idea is to see where the negotiations are around the halfway point, and then get a sense of what issues are really becoming quite thorny and difficult, and what issues we're starting to see some movement on. And then finally, we have the closing plenary. So whether there's an agreement or not, whether we have a treaty text or not, or proposed set of options that will move forward or not, there is always a closing plenary where states are able to make their closing speeches, their closing remarks, again, often very lofty. Some of the observers and stakeholders are able to participate as well. And we then get a sense of what moving forward the next steps will be before the meeting is either closed or adjourned by the chair. And there is a difference, there's an important difference in the sense that uh, typically a meeting will be gavelled closed by the chair. However, to achieve something like a continued session, so for the Plastics Treaty, for example, um, where perhaps only a certain number of negotiations were authorized, and we don't have an outcome at the end of those negotiations, rather than closing the meeting formally, which would mean that the meeting sessions are done, there is no treaty, and additional authorizations for meetings would have to come from the UN Environment Assembly. Instead, there is a decision for the chair to adjourn the meeting, so not close it formally, hold it open, but hold it over to a next session, which wouldn't then require a formal approval or formal authorization from the UN Environment Assembly or the authorizing entity, whatever that might be. It's a really technical point, but it's a point that keeps becoming important, so I wanted to raise it. And then one other thing before we, yes, that's right, before we move on to your questions, is the idea of a legal drafting group or an equivalent in name. This can be convened, typically it's created and convened towards the end of a treaty process. And it is comprised of, well, I will classify myself as a very boring academic. My colleagues, not as much. They can be academics, they can be, long-term negotiators who are legal experts, but typically legal experts in some capacity who are nominated by their countries or by countries that they work with to sit on a legal drafting group. And it sounds exotic, but really what it means is you go through and you make sure that text as it comes to you, so proposed textual language, um, legally makes sense, wouldn't conflict with international law, um, has the appropriate punctuation. So this is where those of us who are good lawyers can argue for hours on end about whether we use a comma or a semicolon, um, which is fun for me. But anyway, and also whether there are conflicts within various proposed elements of the treaty to flag them. Now, the legal drafting groups cannot say, okay, we're going to return you new text that has all of these changes made. Here you go. What the legal drafting group can do is say these are the conflicts, these are the problems, they need to be fixed by the plenary, and then send it back to the plenary. And the plenary makes those decisions and has those debates. But it is the job of the legal drafting group to find them and to essentially clean the text in that way, which sounds very mundane. But when you think about it, if we have two contact groups or more that are working at the same time, and let's say the issue of national reporting comes up in front of both of them, one may forward a set of text that says a country has to make a report on subsidies every 5 years, and the other may come back and say national reporting must be done every 3 years. They're not working together. They're not necessarily coordinating. It is natural that different timelines and different things like this will come up, different benchmarks will come up. So that's why you would have an outside treaty body, an entity in the treaty negotiations that would look and say, oh, wait, you said 5 years here, you said 3 years here. What do we want? Do we want five? Do we want three? Do we want four? What do we want? Just to highlight where these inconsistencies are, because otherwise, if we didn't catch those and everything just got jumbled together into a draft and everyone agreed to it, then there would be a number of implementation and interpretation problems when we actually put the treaty into place. And the point is to make as comprehensive and useful a treaty as we can that also makes sense from the beginning. At least that's what most of us want. So if we can do things like using legal drafting groups to make sure that that can happen, that we don't have issues, then that's also really important. So that's why I raised the legal drafting group, just so you have a sense of what it is as well, because it will often be discussed towards the end part of a negotiation. I will now stop speaking. I'm 5 minutes over. I'm sorry. And stop sharing my screen. And then I'm happy to take questions. When I'm doing the presentations, I'm not able to see the chat, but I can take a look at the chat now and see what comes up. But Shellen, Jimena, Samuel Jose, do you have anything?
You are bringing up a lot of memories today and a lot of foreseeable
I
things of what's ahead potentially. I don't know if that's good or bad.
foreshadowing our lives, Shellen, foreshadowing our lives.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Oh, the memories.
Okay.
I just wrote an article on the process. I finished it last night. The memories were
Anyway, we could probably have an entire session on that.
yes.
But Hannah, I
Oh,
see
we
your
could.
hand.
Yes.
I see your hand raised. We'll put you in the queue. First question, I think this means how long does this all take? From the it's very broad.
Oh, so the whole concept of negotiating a treaty can take years, it can take decades, it really depends. And so like the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement took 16 years. The process actually took 22 in the sense that the formal work started on it at a certain point, and then the treaty negotiation process really began. So that is the thing that we all look at and go, we really don't want that ever again. Um, Sometimes you see, and now you're really starting to see an effort certainly by UNEA to do this. You see when the treaty negotiations are authorized that a timeline is provided or at least requested, so that we don't have, decades of negotiations. So, for example, for the plastics treaty, it was 2.5 years. For the negotiations to create a science policy panel for pollution, which when it is hopefully created soon, hopefully in June, will be the equivalent of the IPCC or IPBES in terms of reporting and scientific information on now the three aspects of the triple planetary crisis. That was also given the same time frame. So if there isn't a time frame, then the negotiations will go on as long as they take. Even if there is a time frame, it is possible to kind of extend it in the sense of being able to adjourn meetings, etc. And then also if the question was how long it takes in terms of how long the sessions are themselves, um, that again will depend, and typically the secretariat, the negotiation secretariat will determine that. Um, Often it's 5 days, sometimes it's 7 days. Exceptionally, when we start to get towards the end of the process, the negotiations tend to be longer. So, in the plastics context, we have 9 days scheduled for the final session, hopefully. In 5.2 for the next session. When we had the negotiations to create the global framework on chemicals, that was actually almost 2 weeks of negotiations at the end. So it does depend on what the Secretariat thinks will be necessary to give enough time to allow everything to be debated and agreed to, but not so much time that we all wind up just having really long conversations and don't feel any pressure and so feel like we can just chat for hours, and many people do, as Shellen knows well. But that is a great question. Thank you.
I see the person who asked the question raise their hand. Is it Sinli Owala? I hope we answered it properly.
Yeah. Hi. Is it all right if I'm
Hi.
unmuted?
You're audible.
Okay. Thank you. So my name
We,
is Simi. Okay. Simi is fine. Just Simi. So I was actually
I see
asking
me.
about the negotiation treaties. Like you've answered. Thank you very much. But you said there's been a treaty negotiation that went on for 22 years. That's really long. By the
It
end
is
of
really
this
long.
sorry?
It is very long. It is.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm wondering at the end of these negotiations, the ones that take that long, will the negotiations still be relevant? Things would have changed if there's a multilateral
Yeah.
negotiation, for example, about maybe environmental pollution in let's say Lake Chad, for example, the countries
Yeah.
that surround Lake Chad and all the countries that are involved in mining and things, all the countries
Hmm.
involved. By the time the negotiation they've reached an agreement, there's a very high probability that the lake has completely dried off, or the things they
Exactly.
were even negotiating. Like, so why are there systems in place to ensure that this doesn't happen, or that the treaties are still relevant after all the time has gone by?
I wish I could say yes, and that we have to have like a relevancy test as part of it. That isn't typically part of the process, but the number of years will be dependent on what the issue is. And so if we're looking at something that is more regional or more kind of shared resource based, typically they don't take that long because there's a sense that this is a problem, it's a shared problem, and often neighbors actually have a very good they have a good sense of what they need to do to address the immediate issue that is there. When we're at the global level, it becomes a bit easier for negotiations to take a lot longer because often the sense of threat isn't shared. The level of threat isn't shared. The way that one country experiences plastic pollution will be very different than the way another country does. And so some countries have much more of a sense of pressing nature, and then others don't. So in the example you gave, which is a really important example, we would expect that that would be much easier to conclude in a shorter time frame, even if it is a very difficult negotiation. But there isn't anything that says you have to do this within a certain time or it has to be relevant, other than obviously the countries themselves being willing to agree to it. But when you do have a long negotiation, you do see a number of different shifts and phases. And you think about what has taken place over the past 20 years. Um, Regimes come and go, governments come and go, knowledge increases or decreases. So that then starts to impact on the process as well. And so it is a much harder negotiation when it takes place over that long a time frame.
I think we're not to go more into this question, but I think we're seeing that urgency in the plastics treaty negotiations because we've already had a major
Yeah.
government shifts last year, and as well as the urgency, the science that keeps coming out more and more clearly. This is a big
Yeah.
problem, but you don't want it to drag on. Even Paris took 6 years, for example, and a lot of people argue, did it take 6 years?
It did. No, it did.
Yeah.
To get to
So,
Paris, it did. Yeah.
yeah. So anyhow, next great question is, isn't it mandatory for all the negotiators involved in a treaty discussion to be at all locations of negotiations, even if it's rotating?
Is it mandatory for, can you
For
say that again?
Is it mandatory for all the negotiators involved in a treaty discussion to be at all the locations, even if it's in
Hmm.
its rotations?
No. So a country can decide to send people or not. Sometimes it becomes very difficult, especially for countries with smaller delegations, to be at all the negotiations. So they may be at some, but not others. What we saw during the INC5 process was actually so in late November into early December of 2024 was actually that a lot of the negotiators were also people who were present at the conferences of the parties that started in October, the meetings for the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement. And then we're also scheduled to go after the INC process to the Conference of the Parties for the Desertification and Drought Convention. So exceptionally, this was the year when all of those were meeting at the same time. And often for the smaller delegations, there had to be a choice made as to who would go or whether one of their delegations would go or whether they would actually be present because they also had to be present in all of those other fora at the same time. And both cost wise and also staff time wise and family burdens, et cetera, made it very difficult to commit to being in all of those fora. So there is no requirement that everyone has to be there. Some countries do come and go. Some countries come for a portion and then can't stay for the whole thing. So that's very much a choice for the parties and the countries to be there and be present.
Great. Now, the next two questions are, I think, very relevant.
And I think
What
I just saw also a comment. Ellen, we're losing you.
I
You're breaking up.
I'm changing my Wi-Fi.
Yes, I think
And
Shellen
what
breaking a little bit.
while you're coming up or while you're coming back, I just wanted to point out Natasha made a comment in the chat that I just saw, which I think links directly to what I was just talking about. Because obviously countries do change, that also can impact on whether or not countries will be present. So sometimes you have a new government coming in that wants to be involved in a negotiation where it hasn't been. Sometimes you have a new government coming in that decides it doesn't want to be involved. So these are all sovereign issues that get resolved at home.
Okay, now I think I'm back.
Yes, you're back.
Wi-Fi challenges. The
Yay.
next question is, how do you see the current immigration and visa issues happening at the moment going to affect the plastics treaty? And we've seen a little bit in the past, even from delegations.
Yeah. No, we have. We have, and we've seen that there are efforts by the UNEP entities themselves to try to step in and, to the extent possible, provide guidance and support. But obviously, they can't compel states to do anything in terms of their own visa requirements. It does come up often in the context of, well, actually, in two contexts. First, it comes up using plastics as an example for especially African civil society members who often have a great deal of trouble accessing visas because of the amount of time it takes to get visas, for example, into Western Europe or into, for example, Busan or into South Korea, etc. So that was one concern. But typically, when governments say that they want to host, they do at least set up some type of sub office or designate someone within their immigration departments who will work with the governments. But it certainly it can have an impact in the sense that it creates extra stress. It also can make it more difficult for civil society, so observers and stakeholders to be present because it may take a while to get their visas approved. The other question that does come up periodically is how or whether or guarantees that indeed this can happen, representatives and negotiations or negotiators from delegations representing countries that might have very tense relationships or perhaps sanctions with host countries would be allowed in. And this is something that certainly came up several times in the context of the INC process for the plastics treaty. Again, typically
I like
the
bananas.
host countries will make
Do you like
a
pork?
pledge. Will make a pledge that at least the main heads of delegation and some delegation members will be allowed in, although often for a very limited visa. So the visa will be allowed only, or they'll be allowed only in the territory for entering and exiting the negotiation, and the negotiation itself, they won't be able to say take a holiday with their family afterwards.
Yes, which a lot of negotiators and observers tend to do if they can.
If we can just make it to leave the hotel room, it's a good thing. You want to stay in bed for several days. Anyway.
Next question, and we are trying to get through as many as possible. I see there's also a hand raised, so we'll
Yes,
try our
yeah.
best. I've heard, and this I think is also very relevant to plastics, but just it's a bigger conversation beyond this, beyond the UNF Triple C process in general. I've heard suggestions for changing the consensus-based decision to a majority voting for the UNF Triple C. What are the pros and cons of changing this rules of procedure, and is it feasible to improve efficient decision making? And as I said, I think this is a huge conversation that's being had at the moment.
It is a huge conversation, and it's one that I think is critical. It's one that's also, we could spend hours debating and discussing. The concern in the UNFCCC system, as I mentioned before, is that they use only a consensus system. So every decision has to be made by consensus, which again is like the highest way of respecting state sovereignty, saying that if one state dissents, everyone has to honor that. The problem is that that becomes very easily a political tool and a negotiation strategy that can stall or forestall many things and can result in very little action actually taking place, even when every other country wants to do something. Which is why we see the UNEA rules and we see the UNEP rules being different, and we see them allowing for the use of voting in certain very extreme situations. So if the UNFCCC system switched to uh, consensus as the preference and then voting as an option, it would potentially facilitate more decisions being taken. And right now, what we've seen, especially in the last few conferences of the parties, is a real concern that decisions are not being made in a timely manner. And so we're not able to implement a lot of the requirements coming in, especially with the Paris Agreement, and just adapting to the reality of the science, which tells us more and more that we're in a very bad place in terms of the carbon emissions targets that we have, and in terms of the overall global warming levels. Um, Even if there was a huge push to do this, however, it has to be remembered that changes to the rules of procedure right now would still have to be done according to the old rules of procedure. So if you want to change the rules of procedure, you have to take a vote according to the current rules of procedure. So you would need consensus in order to then adopt a change that would go to a vote. So practically, I think this will be very difficult to achieve. We've seen a certain block of countries emerging in Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, in Minamata, in the plastics negotiations, that are very much attached to the idea of maintaining consensus as the ultimate voting system. And so I think even though there are some definite pros to using voting, and even though it does allow for a greater respect of the will of the collective international community, I think it would be very difficult to achieve in the UNFCCC context, because you would have to change the rules of procedure using consensus, which is, it's very muddled. Anytime you get into these discussions, it's like it's really muddled, and I feel like I need a chart and a map. And maybe that's something that I think about doing, like, I don't know, maybe for Thursday. Or maybe just as an additional product, an additional slide, we just do like little arrows. I don't know. My graphic skills are not that good. But it is a really complex question, and it's a great question. Thank you for raising it.
I think wrong. I hope I pronounced it right. You're the one that raised your hand. You asked the question. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, it is wrong. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Harrington, for a very comprehensive answer for that. So my understanding is that even if we want to change the rule of law, no, not to change the rule of law. If we want to change the voting procedure, we'll still need to go
Yeah,
through the rule of procedure, which means to
exactly.
vote if we wanted to
Exactly.
change that rule. Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And also, my second part of the question is that, as also Shellen also mentioned, that this is also something mentioned in the Plastics Treaty, also something discussed in the WTO
Mhm.
settings. Do you think that hypothetically, if there is this change coming through, would that come through the UN General Assembly, for example? Is that coming from like a top-down
Mm.
procedure for like, oh, we're going to change the rule for the entire United Nations, and so every branch could kind of adopt that? Or is it more coming from um, either individual branch of the UN, say UNFCCC, we want to adopt this, and then we just kind of like see that as an example for other branches to follow?
So it's wrong. It's a great question, and thank you. And I know you've asked questions before, and they're always really great. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, and keep asking them. Please keep asking them. Even after we're done, keep asking them. Unfortunately, the way that things work is that each treaty itself makes reference to the Conference of the Parties adopting rules of procedure, and those rules of procedure then governing and being amended by the Conference of the Parties. So even if the General Assembly wanted to put out something that said, we endorse, we support the use of voting, of majority voting, of non-consensus based voting requirements, we still would see that each of the treaty bodies themselves would have to adopt that separately, because as a matter of law, each treaty is a separate piece of law, and each COP would have to make that decision and would have to make the amendment. There certainly would be a great deal of pressure, for example, if the UN General Assembly did make that statement, or if UNEA were to adopt, although it would be very unlikely right now that they would, but if UNEA were to adopt a resolution encouraging the treaty bodies to do this, there would be a great deal of political pressure. But legally, each treaty would have to go through and make its own change, which
Right.
some of that may take a shorter period of time. Obviously, in plastics, this is still under discussion. And when we get to the treaty itself and the rules of procedure for the treaty, that discussion would happen from the beginning. Others might need to take a great deal of time for that to happen. Um, so we would still see some inequality until that's actually all settled.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
So
Ron.
excellent question. I'll let Hannah ask her question now, since I
Yeah.
know we're getting towards the end. I want to make sure we get to all the
Yes, and
questions.
Hannah's hand has been up for ages. So hi, Hannah. Good to see you.
Hi, hi, Dr. Harrington. Hi, Shellen again. Can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you for it's really cool, really interesting. Thank you for your insights. My question is more about, so when you're in these negotiation rounds, physically there in person,
Yep.
yes, the rules of procedure can hinder or slow down the process. But in your experience, what is kind of like usually the biggest human obstacle to finding consensus? And like, what are the best ways of addressing that in your experience?
It's such a great question. I think that the human role actually is one of the mitigating factors, because I think the idea of issues with consensus tends to be from government. There tends to be governments telling their people, you know, we don't want this, you can't agree to that, drawing really hard lines. The people themselves are, they're people, they're representing their governments. When you've done it, it's a challenge because you have your own views and you have your own thoughts, and you might really want to agree on something, but you can't because your government has told you no. And Shellen is right in the comments she just posted. It can be very frustrating, and it is. So I think actually, like the human part of it, the people part of it, is the part that can help us to get to consensus, because it's the people on the ground who have been in the room the whole time. We all now know each other, right? We've worked with each other for a long time. Um, Many of the negotiators also work with each other in other treaty situations and in other COPs. So they have a feel for each other and they can have a conversation. And you can have a conversation in line to get a coffee or in line to get lunch, and often this is what happens. And that aspect of it is, I think, the way that we actually try to foster consensus, because that it is a different thing than the government line. And sometimes, obviously, you can't, right? Your government tells you this, you have no choice. You have to go along with it, even if you don't want to. But where there is some type of room to be had and a consensus to be built based on that, that's where that human element comes in. And that's where just being able to talk and see each other's faces and see the body language is really critical. And that actually links back. It's such a great question in so many ways, but it links back to an earlier question that had come up about like whether we could do something as an online negotiation, or the value of online negotiation. And this is why. This is why it's really important to do things in person. Um, that helps us then to just to understand what people's perspectives are, get to know them as people, not just I disagree with your viewpoint, so I'm good, you're bad, like these types of dichotomies, but really understand the depth of it, and that can help build consensus.
Awesome, thank you. So you're saying that generally the goodwill of the negotiators is there.
Yeah, no, it is.
How does that, because often there are a lot of lobbyists also from lots of different groups that are part of
Oh,
these
yes.
negotiations. So how does the human part then, if you have these negotiators that are in good faith trying to negotiate for consensus to get somewhere, how does the presence of nefarious actors in that process, how does that work?
Thank you again for asking it. So it works in several ways. It works in the very emotional responses. So in Ottawa, for example, we had a number of different posters and images put out by the American Chemistry Council, by others, that were, for example, a little girl laying in a hospital bed, clutching a teddy bear with a plastic mask over her face, going, plastic saves lives. They're very emotive, and that will hit into the negotiators as well, and that will drive certain things home. Obviously, some countries also have a stronger relationship with the lobbying groups, and so they will work with each other. They'll provide information to various countries, etc. So that's where we tend to see it, is a lot of that type of knowledge transfer, influence transfer, et cetera, in that capacity, which puts extra pressure on the negotiators because they have their views, they have their government's views, they know that these industry views are also there, and sometimes they are a bit more competing for government's attention. So it really adds a lot to the pressures on the negotiators, which is why it's so important that it is a personally driven process, in the sense of, recognizing that negotiators are people and seeing them as such and figuring out what those pressures are, how you get around those, all of these things. Um, the Chemical Hotel in Ottawa, what is that, Dylan? I'm looking at the chat and I see it. Were you referring to the hotel I was staying in?
Yes. Sorry, Alex. Not it wasn't your fault,
I didn't
though.
know that. I didn't know that. I didn't intend that. It was just literally attached to the hotel or the convention center.
Well,
And,
at least even, the US senators, that the US congressional delegation that we met admitted it also, that they did not know either. But I know we're running out of time, and I do feel like I want to leave off something light. I know you could agree with this, despite all the drama that we've talked about and everything, and I've noticed this more in my INC3 I think INC4, I was more experienced. I was more kind of locked in the process. Countries that are normally hostile to each other can agree, even if it's procedural. I think that's something to remember,
Absolutely.
especially in these times, that the enemies can agree with each other.
Absolutely. And it's, at the end of the day, when you're looking at something like pollution, especially plastics, but something like pollution, something like an environmental issue, when we realize that it affects everyone, whether you like each other or not, whether you're at war with each other or not, whether you have historical animosity or not, they can actually be tools in a way of like a peace building or at least the understanding building, because we all have bits of plastic in us, right? Whether we're on one side of a border or another, and regardless of what passport we have and what language we speak, we are all exposed at the same level. And so that type of realization can actually be a really strong building block for some type of moving past conflict. So absolutely. There is always a hope. There is always a good side. We can always find something. Even if it's small, we can always find something positive. We can.
Absolutely, every single day, even in
Yes,
these times in the world, as somebody was mentioning earlier.
absolutely. We can.
And with that, I know we have more questions. Unfortunately, we aren't going to get to them, but there's always next time that we'll get to them.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
thank
And
you.
so if you want to send them to me, I can include them in the opening for next time. And yeah.
And I've seen lots of great active discussion. I hope the discussion in the WhatsApp group is satisfactory for everybody. I will stop recording now.